What's up, Hive Mind? It is I, the Toxic Gatekeeper, your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM, and we are here, finally, after a week of not getting home till 5 o'clock, of sick, of stress, of just all this crap. We are here finally to start Megadungeon March. And I thought about it a lot all week long, and I thought this month, we're gonna go old school with our theme. Pyramid in the Desert, old school. A classic. But how can we take that classic of old school Pyramid in the Desert and make it something different? So let's start with our pyramid and our desert around it and see where we can go. So I've already got my first two ideas for my first two encounters in our dungeon, Megadungeon. So now this first idea is very childish. I gotta admit, I think I've had this idea. The first time I had this idea was probably like when I was 12, 15, playing in the sand and thinking about sand encounters in D&D, and how could you do an interesting sand encounter, and then recently again this idea came back to me because I was playing it in the sand with some of the kids at work, and I was like, when you bury your hand in the sand and then you're like, the sand monster. I was thinking, like, what if there was like some kind of sand monster? And I'm not talking like, a sandworm or some type of undead, but what if the sand itself is an encounter? So the first thing I came up with for our dungeon, our mega dungeon, our classic desert in pyramid in the desert encounters, what I'm calling for now, memory sand or doppelganger sand. Okay, so the entrance to our dungeon, our first encounter, will be this plane of memory sand. And what the memory sand is sort of a semi-intelligent, semi-organic sand. And if anything is placed in the sand for longer than a round, the sand will make a copy of whatever was placed in there. And this copy is going to spring up, we'll put it on a timer. So we'll say the copy is going to spring up, D6 rounds after we place something. Now, the sand, isn't smart enough to tell the difference. So again, we get that back to that idea of, just burying my hand. But if I bury my hand in the doppelganger sand, 1d6 rounds later, a doppelganger of my hand will arise. So we have doppelganger sand on a d6 timer. So you place an entire body in the sand, if you're a culture, if you're a nomadic desert culture and you're burying your thing, or if you're doing the Egyptian thing and building these giant pyramids and burying people in the sand, a d6 rounds later, if the thing has been in the ground for a round, a doppelganger, a semi-intelligent doppelganger manifests. If you place a plate in the memory sand, the doppelganger sand, and whether you leave it there or you take it out, a d6 rounds later, a sand doppelganger of the plate appears. Now, obviously, because now these creatures aren't really evil or good. They're not like, oh, I'm a doppelganger of you, so I'm going to try and kill you. They just kind of sort of wander around, especially if it's just a doppelganger sand hand, generally, trying to bring more sustenance to the sand. I mean, what does doppelganger sand live off of? If it's a semi-intelligent, semi-alive colony, sort of this nanotech colony, we'll get to more of that later, of this doppelganger sand, what does it need to survive besides, just being sand? And, whatever, sand needs heat to be sand. Otherwise, it's not sand. It needs a constant source of wind. It needs mountains to make more sand as the mountains slowly evolve. But sand on its own doesn't really need much of anything. So living sand probably wouldn't need that much. As long as it's got sunlight and, the once a year rain and maybe some biodegradable stuff to dissolve every now and then to keep the swarm, the nano sand alive in this sort of semi-state. Why does it make doppelgangers of everything that you place into it? Who knows? Why can't it tell the difference between a plate and a hand and a full body and a dead monster? Who knows? It's just this semi-intelligent, almost like nanite sand, anything that is buried underneath it. And it has to be completely buried, you know. So if you bury the hand, all you're going to get is a hand. But if you bury an entire body, you will get an entire body. Now, these things are semi-intelligent, but they're not really hostile, you know, because they're sand, and the intelligence, the base need of the swarm is, you know, just occasionally get something to dissolve, you know, be buried in the sand or feed off of creatures in the sand. So they're, you know, they're basically driven by the same things like an insect would be driven by: feeding and reproduction. Now, it reproduces by, you know, having things buried in it. And then the thing animates and moves. And it moves far enough away that it eventually, you know, and then collapses because sand, and then starts a new colony of memory sand. And what does it feed off of? Well, it feeds off of the biodegradable stuff that is buried in it, whether by accident or on purpose. You drop a leather shoe, it's going to eat that. You drop a dead body, it's going to eat that. You stupidly lay in the sand because you want to protect yourself from the heat, it's going to start heating you. Or it's going to send its doppelgangers to attract more things to the patch of memory sand. So if you know, there's a doppelganger of a person walking across the sand, somebody else is going to go, oh, hey, there's somebody over there, it must be safe. And then they'll walk over there and potentially provide the colony with more biodegradable stuff to consume, whether it be poop or trash or some dead body, or, you know, if this a living body, if you're dumb enough to lay down in the sand and bury yourself to the top of the head, and, you know, the sand's going to start eating you because it doesn't really know the difference. So that's our first encounter. Our first encounter approaching is the doppelganger sand. And we'll have a write-up of the doppelganger sand on the blog. See the link down below. But timer for sand doppelgangers is D6, but they're not necessarily hostile. But the party's not going to know that. And because these are sand constructs, you know, obviously blunt weapons and piercing weapons are going to do nothing to them. You know, I mean, slashing weapons and piercing weapons are going to do nothing to them. They're sand. On the other hand, blunt weapons are going to just ruin their day. And obviously, heat, you know, is just going to turn them into glass, which doesn't melt. Cold will freeze them. So most elemental magic, with the exception, I think lightning's probably not going to affect them because sand. But yeah, a strong wind is going to take these guys out because they're just, you know, sand. And there's not like they're super uber magically animated sand golem. It's just these weird sand doppelgangers. So our next encounter, next of our first two encounters going into our pyramid, is a colony of sand doppelgangers who have become slightly dangerous. Okay, so these guys are going to be much closer to the pyramid, or maybe they'll be farther away from the pyramid. I don't know. I still haven't decided, but they live in an underground sort of sand cave that has been hollowed out by a river that used to run through here. And these are sand doppelgangers that have sort of gained a sentience and an almost undead-like quality. In fact, they're probably closer to ghouls now than they are to sand doppelgangers. And these sand ghouls look like humanoids, and they are hungry for sustenance. I got hair in my hand mouth. I don't know why. I'm sorry. But they're not going to wait around. They've gotten a taste, so they're attacking people, and this will probably be the first flat-on combat our players run into, where these sand things, these humanoid sand creatures, are just going to mob them and try and drag them into their cave, where they're going to try and turn them into new sand creatures and feed off their biological remains. You know, and maybe what they do is they have like this weird ritual where they try and, you know, hold the player character up and have the memory sand pour on top of them, and, you know, or maybe they just knock them down and just attack them like ghouls. And if, you know, the sand ghoul kills somebody, it rises up within a D4 rounds as a new sand ghoul. You know, either way, both is pretty frightening. The holding somebody and watching them drown in sand, you know, is much more cinematic and much more frightening and much more horror movie cultish kind of Wicker Man thing than just claw claw bite, and if I kill you, you come back. So, but obviously that is a very hard thing to pull off because, you know, while it sounds good on your head, you know, an actual encounter where you're going to be able to drag a player character underground, hold them in this weird ritual chamber, head up so that they get buried in this, you know, hourglass, constant, you know, falling memory sand. Yeah, that's going to be kind of difficult. But maybe that could be an optional encounter, like if they manage to capture somebody alive, but that's like the main way. Maybe they make new sand things. Maybe that's how they make like greater sand golems, or the sand golem casters, is they have to undergo this weird ritual that they learned by watching mummies getting made or something. We're still thinking about it, but definitely our second encounter, or I don't know, they might run into that first before the memory sand, and then, but I kind of like the idea of there being a false entrance to the Megadungeon, and that's their lair, that they've, you know, found this little pocket. So I don't know where we're going to put it, but we have encounter number 1 is our memory sand, or our doppelganger sand, and number 2 is our sand ghouls. And we want these guys to be really, really, you know, just so weird and so different, you know, animated sand crawling out of the sand and dragging people under the sand. That's just such a frightening idea that definitely needs to be played with. So there we go. Megadungeon March are our take on the classic Pyramid in the Desert with our first 2 encounters, doppelganger sand and sand doppelgangers that have gained sentience and become these sort of sand ghouls that are attacking the party and trying to drag them under the sand and turn them into new doppelganger sands. Yes, it should be interesting. As for more, we will discuss that later. Like, you know, the possibility that this is actually a crashed spaceship, and that's why there is a nanite swarm surrounding it, because that would just be so, you know, OGL kind of thing. So that's it. Haven't come up with a name for this place yet. Thinking of calling it God Home, but that might have already been used. But for now, so we're just going to call it Pyramid Megadungeon March Project. Comment down below. Check the link for the information on the actual stat blocks for the 2 monsters we've introduced on my blog, and I will talk to you losers later.